Few countries arouse as much curiosity as Russia. It is a place shrouded in secrecy, with a closed government, an enigmatic president, and decisions that the rest of the world never fully understands. But there is a part of Russia that is even more mysterious than the Kremlin. An isolated territory, inaccessible for decades, full of military bases and treated as if it were a state secret. This place is called Kamchatka, a peninsula in the far east of Russia that, for almost half a century, remained out of reach of any visitor. Today on Bello Mundo, we are going to discover this hidden land surrounded by mysteries and stories that seem to have come from another planet. Number 1. Location and geography. Iceland loves the title Land of Ice and Fire. It is true that the island has huge glaciers, geysers, and 130 volcanoes scattered throughout its territory, but there is a corner of the planet that leaves Iceland in the dust. And that place is the Kamchatka Peninsula, which, believe it or not, has approximately 160 volcanoes, almost 30 of which are still active. There are so many volcanoes that, from the capital Petropavlovsk, they say that in any direction on the horizon, there is always a snow-capped giant in sight. And we'll talk more about this impressive scenery in a moment. Many travelers joke that if George R.R. Martin had known about this peninsula, he would not have set his A Song of Ice and Fire in medieval Europe. But here, after all, what setting could be more perfect than snow-capped volcanoes, eternal glaciers, and a land that was forbidden to the world for almost half a century? But before talking about the natural wonders, it is worth locating this territory on the map. You may remember that in September 2025, an earthquake measuring 7.4 on the Richter scale shook Russia and even triggered a tsunami warning in the Pacific. Well, that's where it happened. We are talking about a remote and narrow peninsula that stretches for more than 1,000 kilometers between the Pacific Ocean and the Bering Sea. It is so far from Moscow that the time difference is 9 time zones, which gives you an idea of its isolation. The terrain is marked by mountain ranges running from north to south, separated by glacial valleys and rivers fed by melting ice. On the coast, humidity forms dense forests. Inland, dry tundra and lichen-covered fields predominate. The climate is harsh, long winters, with temperatures easily dropping to -20 degrees, and short summers that barely reach 20 degrees above zero. A land shaped by the clash between ice and fire, where nature has always dictated the rules, and where every detail reinforces how much we are facing one of the most extreme places on the planet. Number 2. Indigenous peoples and life before the Russians. Long before Moscow set its sights on this frozen piece of the map, people were already living on the peninsula. Nomadic peoples learned to survive amid volcanoes, meltwater rivers, and endless winters. They had no roads, no cities, only a direct coexistence with raw nature. Among these groups were the Itelmens, the Koryaks, and other smaller peoples, each with their own customs, but all dependent on fishing and hunting. Salmon has always been the basis of life. During migration, millions of fish swam up the rivers in schools so dense that it looked like the water was moving on its own. This spectacle guaranteed food for the entire year. They fished, smoked, and stored the fish in underground shelters, from which they took food throughout the winter. In addition to fish, they hunted smaller animals such as hares and birds, and collected roots and fruits from the tundra. It was a hard life, but one perfectly adapted to the hostile environment. The villages were simple, made of wooden and mud huts covered with thick skins to keep out the cold. In the more northern areas where mobility was essential, many used transportable tents mounted on reindeer-drawn sleds. This allowed them to follow both the herds and the fishing cycles. The culture was also reflected in their relationship with nature. For the Telmen, for example, volcanoes were living entities, capable of protecting but also of punishing. Stories about spirits of fire and ice were passed down from generation to generation. Each eruption or earthquake was understood as a warning, and no one doubted that those mountains had a will of their own. It was in this context of isolation, tradition, and extreme adaptation that the first Russian explorers arrived in the 17th century. From then on, life in this remote corner of the world began to change irreversibly, opening a new chapter in the history of the peninsula. Number 3. The arrival of the Russians and the Empire. In the 17th century, the Cossacks of the Russian Empire began to advance through Siberia in search of new lands and tributes. It was during this endless march eastward that they reached the peninsula. For the native peoples, their arrival was anything but peaceful. The Russians demanded taxes in the form of furs and food, and conflicts were not long in coming. Shortly thereafter, the territory became strategically important. In 740, the city of Petropavlovsk was founded, named after the ships St. Peter and St. Paul, which had anchored there during Vitus Bering's expedition. This city grew as a naval base and trading post, as well as a support point for voyages across the Pacific. Its geographical position soon attracted attention. Kamchatka was Russia's spearhead into the ocean and served as a watchtower against any attempted invasion. During the Crimean War in 1854, an Anglo-French fleet attempted to take Petropavlovsk. However, the local population, alongside the military, managed to resist and expel the enemies. This victory became a symbol of pride for the inhabitants and is still remembered today with monuments in the city. From then on, the territory came to be seen not only as a distant frontier, but as an outpost of Russian defense in the Pacific. Even so, it remained a land that was difficult to access, isolated and with little connection to the rest of the empire. This scenario set the stage for what would come later, when the Soviet Union transformed the peninsula into a veritable fortress, closed off from the world. Number 4. The Soviet era and isolation. When the Soviet Union took control, the peninsula ceased to be just a distant point on the map and began to play a central role in military defense. The region became a base for nuclear submarines, strategic aviation, and facilities that were beyond the reach of any foreign gaze. To protect these secrets, Moscow made a radical decision: to close off the region completely. For almost half a century, neither foreigners nor ordinary Soviet citizens could enter without special permission. Petropavlovsk, the capital, appeared on maps but was out of reach for any tourist. It was as if it did not exist. This isolation created an even greater air of mystery. While other parts of the Soviet Union, even under surveillance, still received occasional visitors, here there was no chance. It was forbidden territory, guarded as if it were a natural fortress surrounded by ice and mountains. For the residents, life went on amid this peculiar reality. Many worked directly for the army or in services linked to military bases. The peninsula received investments in infrastructure, but everything revolved around defense. It was a land crisscrossed by roads leading to secret complexes with access gates and constant surveillance. When the Soviet Union began to open up in the 80s, this part of the country remained one of the most closed. Only after the collapse of the regime in the early 90s did the gates open for good. And then the rest of the world was finally able to discover what was inside the territory that for decades had been treated as an absolute secret. Number 5. Nature. When the world was finally able to see what had been hidden for so long, the first surprise was the force of nature. This region is home to one of the largest populations of brown bears on the planet. During the salmon migration months, entire rivers seem to turn into open-air restaurants, with dozens of bears fishing side by side. It's the scene every visitor hopes to see, and it's not hard to find. But they are not the only protagonists. In the sky, stellar sea eagles fly overhead, enormous birds with a wingspan of up to 2.5 meters. In the seas, humpback whales, orcas, and seals appear frequently, taking advantage of the food-rich waters. There is so much life that the peninsula has become a paradise for bird watchers and nature photographers. The flora also follows the rhythm of extremes. Coniferous forests grow on the lower slopes, but just a few kilometers higher up, the landscape turns into tundra, with lichens and small shrubs. When summer arrives, even if it is short-lived, the fields are filled with colorful flowers, creating a striking contrast with the snow-capped mountains in the background. And as if that weren't enough, there are also geothermal phenomena. The Valley of Geysers is the second largest geyser field in the world, with dozens of jets of boiling water exploding at regular intervals. Next to it, the Uzon caldera features bubbling mud pits and mineral lakes that look like scenes from science fiction. All of this makes the peninsula a unique place. Within a few miles, you can see a bear fishing, an eagle flying overhead, a geyser spouting, and a glacier stretching to the horizon. It is as if nature has concentrated all its forces in this part of the planet. No wonder much of the peninsula is considered a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Number 6. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. In the midst of such wild scenery, there is a city that concentrates much of the life on the peninsula, Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. Founded in the 18th century, it grew around Avacha Bay, one of the largest in the world, surrounded by mountains and volcanoes that seem to watch over the horizon at all times. About 140,000 people live there, making the city the administrative, economic, and cultural heart of the region. It is from there that planes, ships, and practically all the infrastructure that supports the population arrive and depart. Despite its isolation, the urban center has schools, universities, museums, cafes, and even a modest but active cultural scene, which guarantees leisure and learning options for residents. What stands out most, however, is the scenery. From anywhere in the city, you can see the snow-capped volcanoes rising up. It is a view that reminds everyone where they are. Even from the port, surrounded by fishing boats and military vessels, the volcanic cones dominate the horizon and serve as a constant reminder that nature reigns supreme. The atmosphere today is peaceful, but the military presence is still visible, as bases and strategic installations remain active in the surrounding area, reinforcing the city's historical role as Russia's outpost in the Pacific. At the same time, there is a relaxed air that surprises visitors. Shops, restaurants specializing in fresh fish, and boat trips around the bay give the city an atmosphere of a gateway to greater adventures. It is as if Petropavlovsk is the transition line between urban life and the wild world that dominates the rest of the peninsula, a perfect invitation to the next stage of our journey. Number 7. Tourism and Adventures. After opening up in the 90s, this remote corner began to attract travelers who are not satisfied with ordinary destinations. But opening its doors did not mean becoming accessible. Even today, reaching this part of the Russian Far East is not easy. There are no roads connecting the peninsula to the rest of the country. The only way is by plane, departing from Moscow or other cities in eastern Russia. And even once there, the most famous spots can only be reached by flying. This is not a place for mass tourism, but for those seeking adventure and direct contact with nature. The trails to volcanoes are one of the most sought-after experiences. Some, such as Avachinsky and Motnovsky, allow for relatively accessible climbs, where you can see smoking craters, frozen lava fields, and intensely colored lakes. Others, such as Klyuchevskoy, the largest active volcano in Eurasia, are a challenge only for experienced mountaineers. For those who prefer to observe rather than climb, helicopter tours are almost mandatory. This is the only way to reach places like the Valley of Geysers or the Uzon caldera, which we mentioned earlier, as these are areas without roads that remain isolated even today. The sea also has its place. Boat expeditions travel along the coast to observe whales, orcas, and seabird colonies. On some black sand beaches, such as Kalaktirsky, even surfing has found its niche, even though the water is freezing all year round. And how can we not mention the hot springs? In a region where winters are harsh, bathing in natural hot water pools has become a tradition. Places like Paratunka welcome entire families at any time of the year, and even foreign visitors join in the routine. It is not a simple destination. It requires physical preparation, appropriate clothing, and often specialized guides. But that is precisely what makes the trip so memorable. Number 8. Current population and culture. Today, about 350,000 people live on the peninsula. Most, as we have seen, are concentrated in the capital, but there are also concentrations in other important cities, such as Yelizovo, where the airport is located, and Vilyuchinsk, a prominent port and strategic naval base. Outside these centers, the population is spread out in small villages, many of them made up of Russians, mixed with indigenous groups such as the Koryaks, Itelmens, and Avans. Daily life is not easy. The harsh climate and isolation make life difficult, but this also strengthens the sense of community. In small towns, almost everyone knows each other, and in remote villages, ancient practices are still maintained, such as hunting rabbits, picking berries in the tundra, and fishing for salmon with traditional nets during the summer. Modernization has arrived, but gradually. Today there are schools, local universities, and even winter festivals with dog sled races and ice fishing competitions. Even so, the culture remains closely linked to survival in the midst of nature. One example is the Salmon Festival, when the entire community celebrates the end of the fish migration, which provides food for much of the year. On the coast, it is common to find traditions of sailors and fishermen that remain to this day and reinforce the connection with the sea. The Soviet past still appears in various corners. Monuments to the Crimean War, statues of Lenin, and buildings with communist architecture coexist with modern cafes, cultural centers, and souvenir shops geared toward adventure tourism. Despite this contrast, the current climate is peaceful. There are no internal conflicts. The greatest risks come from nature itself: volcanoes, winter storms, and the earthquakes we mentioned at the beginning of the video, always remembering how this part of the planet remains an extreme and challenging territory for those who live there. So, did you enjoy getting to know this isolated and mysterious part of Russia? What surprised you most about this unique place? Tell us in the comments. And before you leave, subscribe to the channel. Turn on the bell so you don't miss any episodes of our Bello Mundo, and try using the new Hype video feature. It really helps the channel reach more people and continue bringing you unbelievable content like this.